Among the Everglades swamps, where swamp sawgrass tangles with cypress roots, a 16-foot Burmese python crawls in search of prey. Soon it will find it, strike, and have its meal. But meanwhile, inside the python itself, another hunt is happening. Another predator is moving with it through the thickets. And no matter what the python does, that predator will prevail and, once victorious, emerge from its body. So while the python is slithering through the Everglades, it's time to take a look inside to see another hunter. A worm-like creature has settled in the snake's lungs and is slowly draining its life, feeding on blood just to stay alive. This is a parasitic crustacean known as the tongue worm. It lays its eggs right inside the python's body, then grows, wreaking massive damage on its host. To keep it more interesting, let's view this stage as if it were a game. Picture a strange mob. A pale parasite, bean sprout-shaped, up to 3 inches long. At times it moves on its own. In rare events, this parasite bursts out through the snake's mouth, pushing from its lungs even after the host has died. Now let's look at the mechanics. Its life cycle is basically a whole chain of quests. The starting stage, the eggs get tossed out of the infected snake's gastrointestinal tract. The next player in this chain is an insect, which picks up this drop and becomes a temporary carrier. Next comes the upgrade. An infected insect gets eaten by an amphibian or a reptile, and now it's nothing more than a temporary resource. The final boss is a new snake that swallows the infected prey. At that point, the tongue worm jumps back into the game, but now on a new field, inside a fresh host, where it calmly grows and develops. Scientists say that a snake's lungs can be home to dozens, even hundreds of these parasites. There's a documented case where, during an autopsy, 107 adult tongue worms were found in the respiratory system of an eastern racer. The consequences of such neighbors are obvious. If a giant worm is settled in the lungs, breathing gets harder, energy runs low, and the snake is doomed in the end. But the problem isn't the parasite itself. It's the fact that it's invasive, just like its original hosts. Invasive Burmese pythons, quickly spreading through Florida's ecosystems, carry with them a tongue worm that's also moving into new areas and onto new hosts. Scientists first found a local snake infected with this creature back in 2012. Tracing the source, they concluded that the disease came from Asia along with Burmese pythons, which were brought to Florida in the mid-1990s. Since then, Rayleigh orientalis has invaded the respiratory system of at least 19 out of 46 local snake species, from banded water snakes to eastern racers. Researchers also note that the population of pygmy rattlesnakes in the Everglades has dropped noticeably. The spread of the parasite might be the reason. By the way, all the infection cases were recorded in the south of the state, right where the pythons have already settled in. Outside their range, no infections were found. Coincidence? Of course not. And it's important to point out one more thing. Burmese pythons, naturally large, can carry a lung parasite for a long time and stay alive. Plus, they evolved alongside tongue worms, so they're more resilient to the infection. But local, smaller snakes are way more vulnerable. They have no defense mechanisms perfected over thousands of years. Their respiratory system is smaller, so a tongue worm can easily disrupt it. Inflammation, infections, loss of normal breathing. None of this ever ends well. In some snakes, adult parasites grow up to almost 4 inches, feeding on the host's blood and leaving pneumonia or even sepsis behind. Weakened reptiles stop hunting and often die of starvation. The threat's only growing. Parasite is shielded from the cold by its host's body so it can survive frost. And Florida's green swampy areas give it plenty of intermediate hosts. That means it can spread further and further, finding more victims. It's possible that the problem with parasites in snakes is way more serious than it seems at first glance. Scientists admit only half of the known snake species in the US and Canada have ever been checked for parasites. What's happening with the rest? Nobody really knows. The key challenge is that snakes are masters of disguise. Finding them in the wild, tracking their lives, and especially figuring out how parasites affect their behavior or health is almost impossible. There are ways to follow individual snakes with implanted transmitters, but it's exhausting and expensive work. And while snakes hide from sight, we tend to underestimate the importance of what's happening, which means the scale of the threat could be much bigger than we think right now. But do we actually need to do anything about it? In theory, you could save some of the infected snakes if you caught them and gave them treatment. In reality, though, that's impossible. You'd have to treat not only the snakes, but also every intermediate host. Frogs, lizards, various cockroaches. Still, scientists are seeing reasons for cautious optimism. Research shows while numbers of some species are dropping, the Florida cottonmouth, even with severe infection, continues to hold its ground. Its immune system seems better at dealing with the parasite. This suggests that some local snakes could still mitigate the effects of the infection and figure out a way to live alongside the new parasite. Perhaps the snakes will even evolve to fight it off. Actually, tongue worms are really impressive. They don't just live in a snake, they can survive even after their host dies, though not for very long. Most other parasites, like flukes, follow the animal when it dies. These worms, living in a snake's mouth, are easy to spot if you carefully make the snake open its mouth. The tiny parasites sit on the roof of the mouth and along the sides. You can even gently pull them out with tweezers, but once the snake dies, it's the end for the parasites too. Flukes can travel the world too. The American snail, Phycella acuta, probably brought the fluke Akitosoma elongatum to Japan, where it started infecting local snakes. Usually these parasites go through a complex life cycle involving snails and maybe frogs before reaching snakes, but even so, their fate is tightly tied to their host. A snake's death is almost always fatal for them. Tugworms are the exception to this rule. They can easily crawl out of the lungs, even after the snake is already dead, and make their way to the mouth. In the world of parasites, that makes them really cool and unusual. Survival after the host dies is extremely rare. Well, in fact, such cases do exist. As an example, scientists point to the Russell's viper, one of the most dangerous snakes in Asia. It's feared for its irritability, lightning-fast strikes, and hematotoxic venom that destroys tissue and blood. But inside this fearsome predator, a completely different enemy can hide nematodes of the genus Callisophilus. These thin worms settle in the stomach and intestines of snakes and lizards. Usually their presence only causes enteritis and related infections, but sometimes the consequences can be deadly. The most curious things happen after a snake dies. One day, researchers dissected a viper that had been killed with aqueous chloratone and found a live tangle of parasites inside. The nematodes didn't care at all that their host was dead. The scientists preserved them for further study. Sometimes it feels like dead snakes can deliver downright impossible surprises. A Reddit user spotted a decaying snake body on a timber rack. When they picked it up and tried to move it, 24 wriggling creatures up to an inch long spilled out from inside. They looked like larvae, but way too big. Nobody in the comments could really explain what it was, but we have a guess. We're talking about the housefly, a synanthropic species that sticks close to humans. Normally it's recognized as a carrier of diseases, but in some situations it acts completely differently. Females may deposit eggs in moist rotting tissue, including wounds on animals. That's how meiosis happens, an infestation by fly larvae that feed on dead or sometimes even living host tissue. In 2010, entomologists received a 27-inch Persian horned viper with an infected wound. When they checked it, the tissue was already infested with fly larvae. After all, the larvae were taken out of the snake's body. They weren't destroyed right away. Some of the material was kept for observation. It was important for the scientists to track the life cycle. 10 larvae turned out to be quite lively and active. And nearby, they found 4 pupae. They put them in separate containers, creating conditions close to natural. Just 3 days later, the process was complete. Adult flies emerged from the pupae, fully confirming that the scientists had correctly identified the species. The snake was extremely weak by this time. Even before the infection, it had shown signs of lethargy and loss of appetite. That's what made it especially vulnerable. The damaged tissue gradually started to rot, moisture gathered around the wound, and that was enough to attract a female fly. It laid the eggs right in the soft, decaying spots. The larva that hatched in that environment quickly burrowed into the wound and began feeding on the tissue. And it's important to understand that adult flies aren't parasites in the usual sense, but under the right conditions, they can easily turn an animal into a living incubator for their larva. Actually, considering that in 3 days, the larva would already turn into adult flies, it means that at the time they were found, they were almost at the final stage of development. A snake overwhelmed by a dozen larvae was lucky to survive. They were eating it from the inside, and without human help, it likely would have died. Such cases are rarely recorded, though they probably happen often, just unnoticed. Had the snake died, the larvae would have continued feeding, completing their cycle. Dead tissue is ideal for larvae. They would mature, pupate, and leave the remains as flies. In one Reddit case, a fly laid eggs in a dead snake, possibly after the snake died during molting. The larvae fed on tissues, turning into adult flies. Only human interference stopped the process. Other decomposers, like ants, soon take over. Ants leave distinct marks, wavy patches or jagged lines, not holes like larvae. These are often mistaken for scratches but are post-mortem damage from ants, especially invasive fire ants, Solenopsis invicta. These aggressive ants destroy larvae and monopolize the corpse, accelerating decomposition while eliminating parasites. In fact, some ants may even kill snakes. For example, the predatory ant Chilomyrmex andicola has sharp mandibles and venom that may paralyze prey. It's the only known New World ant to consume vertebrate flesh. If a parasitized snake is attacked, the ants will eat both the snake and its parasites. In another case on Corfu Island, 2011, a small snake, Dahl's whip snake, survived being swallowed by a 4-line snake. The larger snake was killed by a cat, and the smaller snake was later seen escaping the corpse alive. In 2017, a man filmed a snake regurgitating another, still living snake, likely a panic reaction, as snakes often vomit meals when threatened due to mobility issues post-feeding. Interestingly, viable eggs can sometimes be extracted from dead snakes. If the snake dies close to laying time, and the eggs are mature and handled correctly, they can still hatch. However, it's rare. Eggs must be removed gently without cutting and exposed to minimal contamination. Even under perfect conditions, hatching is difficult and rarely successful, but possible. Another parasite-related case occurred in Australia, 2019, when a carpet python was found with over 500 ticks. Likely sick already, the snake tried to drown the ticks in a pool. Vets removed the parasites, describing the texture like a bag of marbles. The infestation, likely due to prior illness or stress, had weakened the snake severely. Interestingly, male ticks often stay on snakes long-term, waiting for fed females to emit mating pheromones. While females feed and drop off to lay eggs, males remain, sometimes until death. The python, named Nike, suffered from anemia due to blood loss from the ticks. In another 2024 case, a python was found in Florida without eyes, likely due to parasites. These cases show how parasites, ticks in particular, can cripple or kill snakes by draining energy, weakening immunity, and reducing mobility and senses. Too many parasites can ultimately push even strong reptiles past the point of survival.